Hello everybody, this is Johns Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and we're back with another of our 5-Minute Histories videos. And today I'm on Pennsylvania Avenue, Pennsylvania in Fremont, and the great big red brick Italianate church behind me is St. Peter Claver Roman Catholic Church. That's what we're going to talk about today, the church and some of its leaders, who've included notable activists in the civil rights and peace movement, including Philip Berrigan of the Catonsville Nine. But before we get to that, let's say a word about who this church is named after, who it honors, Peter Claver. He was born in 1580 in Spain. By about age 20, he had become a Jesuit and decided he wanted to sail across the Atlantic and do missionary work in Spain's colonies. He sailed over to Colombia, and there he became a Jesuit priest. Now, at that time, the Pope, Paul III, preached very vocally and strongly against the evils of slavery, but that didn't stop Catholics from owning enslaved people, and it didn't stop Jesuit priests from owning enslaved people. If you've read in the news over the last couple years, closer to home, Georgetown University, founded by Jesuits, I believe they owned over 200 enslaved people, and at one time sold all or almost all of them off to pay for the new university, and they're now embarking on an effort to acknowledge and deal with that past. Well, the same in 1600 in Colombia, the Jesuit priests there owned enslaved people, and that became Peter Claver's life's work. In his words, let me quote, he said, "We must speak to them with our hands before we try to speak to them with our lips." And what he did was every single ship that sailed into or out of his port city, he went on board, and if the enslaved folks were sick, he gave them medicine. If they were hungry, he gave them food. In all, he ministered to over 300,000 enslaved people. He died in 1654 of the plague, and a couple hundred years later, in 1888, Pope Leo XIII made him a saint. That very same year, a group of black Catholic Baltimoreans from here in West Baltimore decided that they had had enough of walking across town to St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church in East Baltimore, and broke off and formed their own congregation here, making this the oldest congregation in the world named after Peter Claver. Incidentally, it's the third oldest black Catholic congregation in the country. The oldest is St. Francis Xavier, which was started in the 1790s by a group of French-speaking black Catholics that had come over from Santo Domingo and landed in Fells Point. So that's Peter Claver and the church. Let's say a word about the building itself. When it was dedicated in 1888, Cardinal Gibbons purchased a former Methodist church, the Watcote Methodist Church, and then dedicated it to St. Peter Claver. But it was not this building. This building dates to 1905, when the church here did a major campus redo, and they built this wonderful Italianate church. At the dedication in 1888, back to that, a priest from Wilmington, Delaware was one of the speakers, and he said this. He said, "This church will have its glory and triumph in the colored race, and for aught I know, will be the salvation of this nation." That's a pretty high bar for a brand new congregation, but let's say a few words about how they've tried to achieve that. From the very beginning, the church has been activists. Just 4 or 5 years after its founding, the congregation had grown to 1,000 people strong. One of the first things it did was found a social services center just around the corner called the House of Good Shepherd. One of the folks who led the effort for that was a priest named Charles Uncles. He was the first black priest who was both trained and ordained in the United States, so pretty neat there. By the early 1900s, the congregation and its leaders were pushing for the desegregation of Baltimore's police department and fire department. And then in the 1960s, the church here really ramped up its activism. One of the leaders there was a church leader named Henry Offer. He was sort of the bedrock of the church in the 1960s. He, for one thing, railed against Governor Spiro Agnew, who had laid blame for Baltimore's Martin Luther King assassination riots in the hands of black activists, and Father Offer railed against that. Another thing he did is he organized Baltimore's contribution to the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C. This was an effort, the brainchild of Martin Luther King before he passed away, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It brought over 3,000 people who I think camped out for about 6 weeks on the Mall in Washington to bring attention to the injustices, the economic injustices to poor people of all colors. The final person I want to mention is Philip Berrigan. As a young priest, he was stationed here in the 1960s, and he spent a lot of time also advocating for Baltimore's black communities, but also for peace work. In the 1960s, he helped found something called the Baltimore Interfaith Peace Mission that brought together leaders from Catholic churches, Protestant churches, Jewish synagogues. One notable effort he did in, I think it was 1966, in December, he put on a sandwich board and he walked up and down Howard Street, the main shopping district, during the holidays, and the sandwich board counted down what he called the number of bombing days until Christmas. This was all a prelude to maybe his most famous peace activism that he did with his brother Daniel, which of course was burning draft cards in the incident that was known as the Catonsville Nine. Today, the church is still going strong and still going strong with its activism. Maybe one notable thing it did recently was helped sort of foster a young group called the No Boundaries Coalition that is working to break down boundaries in Baltimore, physical and economic, to bring neighborhoods together. And with that, I'll say thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.